Hi, everybody. How you doing? It's just me tonight. Everybody's so busy with the other stuff we have going on. Some of you know what I mean. Others will find out shortly. I guess the email went out. Workshops are being announced. So, ta-da! All right. Welcome and hello. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to take a look. We got some people watching over there. Hi, I'm Matt. This is BlogChat. Must be Tuesday night. Tonight, we're pulling one out of the vault, but not too far out of the vault. Back in December of last year, I created a blog post about testing your lenses for Coma. Now, why did I embark on this? Well, number one is I have this urge to make sure that I have the right tools in my bag, and I was changing over from shooting with a D750 to a Nikon Z6. So I had a primary mission of lightening my load and trying to choose all native lenses for my Nikon Z6. So I was looking for native Z6 lens mount lenses, right? And I had an opportunity to test new lenses. And one of the things I look for when I'm evaluating a lens is, does it have Coma? And if yes, how bad is it? And at what f-stop does it become manageably, invisible? Or does it go away completely? So I set out to answer these questions. And I had been using for the longest time, my go-to lens was my Zeiss, my 15 millimeter Tessar. I just love this lens. Loved it to death. Manual focus. The other guys like using different lenses. And that's one of the beautiful things about us is that, we have different interests in things and we evaluate things privately and personally. So this was my go-to lens for a long time. And I was thinking about the opportunity of, switching to a lens that might be a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter and, definitely smaller in the bag, right? So this is my opportunity. I'm like, okay, if it's this small, how does it stack up against my benchmark? This one. And I also had recently started shooting with this 20 millimeter Viltrox. These are both 15 millimeters. B&H was kind enough to loan me the Laowa lens. Thank you, B&H. We appreciate you. I purchased the Viltrox on my own because I was so freaking delighted with it once I got to try it. And I had already previously bought this one. So that was my benchmark. I'm going to show you guys what we have here. I'm just going to briefly bring it up so we walk through it. The blog post is linked in the description right now already. But this was the blog post. Getting the best star points for Astro landscapes. How to test lenses for Coma. So I already gave you the setup on this, right? But I need to explain what Coma is. And that's the important part. The thing that might be confusing to some people is it is a homonym. It sounds like another thing that we talk about that we don't like in lenses either. Chromatic aberration, CHRO. Coma is COMA. It's just missing the H, but they're two totally different things. Chromatic aberration is color fringing around high contrast edges, right? Comatic aberration is, and I can bring it up in Photoshop here. I can bring it up here. So this is a graphic I made for the blog, and I'm just going to show you my PSD here. Oh my gosh, you guys get to see behind the curtains here. It doesn't matter down here in the shadows. Chromatic aberrations don't happen in low contrast areas. I zoomed up this area, and you see this? You see this? I guess I'm going to circle it. You see that right in there? That strange bit right there is the problem. That weird shape is chromatic aberration. It makes something that should look like a round point, and it makes it look otherwise. And I'll give you lots of other looks at that. When I didn't make this part of the blog post. When I bought the Viltrox lens, this is a test that I did for myself. This is part of my process in saying, like, okay, I'm going to shoot this lens at 1.8, which it can do all the way out to f4. And this is the corners, and this is how I do it. I shoot this, and I do these crops way above 100%. We got the corners, and you've got the edge, and you've got the center. And those are the three places that you want to look out for coma. And I'm going to zoom in even more so you guys can see it. You see it looks like doves or angels. That's chromatic aberration. And at the corners, that's really distressing. But I need to give you context. That's at f1.8. We're not going to be shooting at 1.8. And this is a reason why you shouldn't be shooting at 1.8 if you're doing star points, because the out of focus areas will be distractingly aberrant, right? So if we look here, we have at f2, the chromatic aberration becomes a little bit less noticeable, right? At 2.8, a little bit less noticeable. At f4, that Viltrox is like pretty dope, back to normal, right? And that's an extreme, that's at the very corner of the lens. If we look at the edge, which is not all the way in the corner, like let's pretend this whole screen here is what we're talking about. This would be the corner, and this is the edge, you know, out there, not as far out, and then center would be center. So at the edge, at 1.8, there's still chromatic aberration, right? And then a little bit less, and then a little bit less. It seems to drop out around 2.8. Yep. At 2.8, it's better at the edges than it is in the corners. And that's what I look for. And then in the center, where there should be no chromatic aberration, if there is, run fast. There is none, right? And even less, and even less, and even less, right? It just doesn't exist in the center. It's usually a faulty lens or a bad design if you find that, right? So this was my decision grid when I was deciding whether to buy the Viltrox. This to me said, heck yes. If I really need to gather some light, I can use 1.8. But I'm probably going to shoot it at 2.8 most of the time, if not f4, because of the chromatic aberration, right? So that's nice, right? So when I was saying, all right, I need to get that 15 millimeter lens, I need that focal length, I set out, and I'm going to switch back to the blog post here. I set out to shoot a grid of images, and I'll show you that right now. But back to this example here, this one from Capitol Reef National Park. This was with an APS-C chip camera and a 7.5 millimeter manual focus lens. It's only $149. I wasn't expecting to have no chromatic aberration. That would be unreasonable. Where it starts to be a nuisance is your star trails will start to be glaringly fat where you have chromatic aberration. So that's how it matters over a long exposure or a stack. From star points, it looks like you didn't focus, but you did. It's the lens just couldn't render what you want. So pardon me. Slack is blowing up. I just have to set my phone on do not disturb. All right. So there we go. So now, why does it matter? You know, this is now that we know what Coma is, we know what it looks like. Why should we care? Why should we care? Well, if you really want to show images that you care about to people whose opinions you care about, or let's say you have clients, you're selling these images, you want them to show up in the best way possible with the gear that you can afford and the techniques that you can acquire. If you don't know to look for Coma when you're purchasing a lens, then you're missing an opportunity to decide between one tool and another. What we're trying to do is open your eyes to it so that it's not a surprise. So in this picture, it has very little. This is that Viltrox I was talking to you about. So I shot 25 frames and I stacked them with Starry Landscape Stacker. Each was 13 seconds long. And then I blended it with a foreground image. And this one had very, very little chromatic aberration, and I shot it at 2.8. So I was really happy with that image. If you have Coma, it's going to confuse Sequator for PC or Starry Landscape Stacker for Mac. Yeah, so that's the thing, is you want to start with the highest quality you can afford so that your output is the highest quality it can be. So moving on. So this is what happens. Coma happens in fast wide lenses primarily. As you stop down the diaphragm, it starts to make the corners sharper. So that's why we approach this test by shooting wide open and then stop it down and stop it down and stop it down until we see coma start to disappear. The balance, of course, is how far do I have to stop down before I start losing stars that I want to keep in the field, in the image, right? So yeah, that's the balance there, and that's why we test for coma. And you should always test for coma within the 30 days or whatever your return period is when you buy a lens, just to make sure it's the lens that you want. Otherwise, you're committing, right? That Nikon 14-24, which I have one over there, was the gold standard for a long, long time. It still is, honestly. It has so almost no coma. It's amazing. It's extraordinary. Moving from that to other lenses, then you're like, oh, that's what coma is. And I shot with the 14-24 for 5 or 6 years. Loved it. And the Irix also exhibits almost no discernible coma, right? When you shoot it at 2.8. So those are lenses we could recommend right off the bat. But I give you these tools so that you can decide for yourself. Do I know what coma is, and does my particular lens have it? So, all right. So let's talk about the lens test. The lens that I was working with, and I'm just going to show my screen for a second here. This Laowa lens, I love it to death, is so manual. It doesn't have an electronic diaphragm. Look at this. What did I do? I can't get the rear lens cap off. There's no electronic caps on the back, contacts on the back of it. So you can't transmit any of the lens information to the EXIF data when you're recording a file. Show it to you there, right? So what do I do about that? Well, got to go old fashioned. You got to go old school. When you stop down the lens, it doesn't even tell you what the aperture was. So I needed to go old school. I created a grid in my notebook, and that grid simply had, on the verticals, it had which lens I was testing. And then the apertures down as the rows, and I'll show you that right now. And you could come back later and look at your EXIF data if you're only evaluating digitally connected, electronically connected lenses. But it's still good to have. The other lens that I borrowed from B&H was the Samyang 14mm. It's a native Z mount. Testing that against the Laowa, the Viltrox, which I owned, and the Zeitz, which I owned. So you'll see it says f1.8, 2.0, 2.84, and then 5.6. And then there's this accurate and default here. I wrote in here for each of these focal lengths what the two NPF exposure durations were. And that is the two different lengths of exposure that I could shoot to have blurry, slightly blurry, or absolutely not blurry stars, which was critical for this test. Accurate is the most accurate, longest shutter speed you can have where the stars will not blur, period. Default is okay for most purposes, and it's even less blurry than the 400 rule, which we recommend for most people starting out. So what I did was I took a picture and then I wrote down the file names. It was that easy. That way I had these when I could come back and look at the test. I know exactly what I'm looking at, and then I could make that monster PSD file, which I'm going to walk you guys through, of copying and pasting things in and out. So this was just my way of saying I know which file absolutely matched the settings that I did, and I was just very meticulous to shoot that. And I'll bring it in and I'll show you what I did. Let me grab Lightroom and pull it over to this window. Okay. There we go. Sorry. YouTube was playing in one of those windows and it was bugging me out here in my own voice. Okay. So back to reality here. So I shot a bunch of pictures. I did a critical focus where I would focus on the street light that was down there all the way away. And then these are the Catskill Mountains going away there, right? And then after I did my focus, I would point straight up at the azimuth so that I would have the darkest part of the sky. And that's all I did was I would do a critical focus horizontally, not on the stars. I would pick something that I knew was absolutely infinity, but still very bright, high contrast to focus on, and then point it straight up at the stars. And I repeated that for both the NPF settings, just because I was curious, right? I wanted to know for myself whether 9.97 seconds or 19.93 would be correct. So I shot all of those sequences, and I knew what I wanted to do was to make sure I bought the right lens. That was my goal. So here they are in the blog post. You can see these images yourself. In fact, at the end, you can download them. So those are my focusing images, so you could see them, knowing I got the absolute critical focus, right? And then I made a test shot at each aperture up to about 5.6. You know, some of these lenses are faster than the other ones. For instance, you know, the Samyang's 2.8, the Laowa is f2, the Viltrox is 1.8, and the Zeiss is 2.8. So 2.8 to 5.6 is fewer images than 1.8 to 5.6. So that's what I was working for. So I worked through it, and this is the fun part I couldn't really do in the blog post. I can pixel peep with you guys. So let's make this as big as we can get, and you guys can see all of the wonderful work that I put into layering this PSD. But let's start here. So we have the Samyang, and it starts at 2.8. So I built my grid there. And then we have corner, edge, and center from top to bottom. So the corner, blur, blur, blur. Let's just zoom really in on that, right? What I did was I really found a star that illustrated the point in the same place, and I did a super zoom, a pixel peeping zoom on it, right? So over here, these are definitely comatic, right? They look like little birds. They look like little birds. They look like little birds. So all the way up to 5.6, the Samyang was a no, an absolute no. It could have been the one that I had, or could it be a characteristic that all the Samyangs for that model have? I don't know. I haven't tested many of them. But in the center, you can see it's not a problem. They're dots, right? They're circles. They're not odd shapes like this. So at the corners and at the edges, they're that. So I don't want to beat a dead horse. That one was not a contender, and it was pretty easy to see. And you can see in my details here, the NPF was 9.9 seconds, right? So the next one we looked at was the Laowa. Spoiler, you probably already know this if you're a subscriber. I chose this lens based on this test. So yes, the Laowa does experience some beautiful angel baby creation at the corners. You see that? It looks like a bird. It has both comatic and chromatic aberration at the same time. So this is this little guy over here, all the way towards the edge, is the big zoom up that I had. So that's chromatic aberration. That's something we don't want, but it's at f2, right? And at 2.8, it is reduced, right? And I was like, huh, all right, well, it's reduced. And I'm doing extreme zoom in here, right? And I did the shortest possible exposure duration. Okay. And this is, you know, stopped down to f4 and a 5.6, right? So we look at the edge, there's still a little coma, and it seems to disappear around f4. 5.6 is fine. And the center, of course, is pretty much fine. Cool, right? So let's move on. Here is what I've been shooting with, and I have been saying for so long was my gold standard, the Zeiss Distagon 15mm f mount 2.8 manual focus lens. Oh my gosh. Look at that Coma. that's a 2.8. So 2.8 f4 and 5.6, it's got worse Coma than the Laowa. And I'm just gonna zoom out a little bit here so you can see them at the same time. The Zeiss has worse Coma than the Laowa. And that blew my mind because this was my gold standard. This was the lens that I had relied on for a long time. In both the corner and the edges, it has more Coma at the same apertures. And that's when I made my decision right there, folks. I said, that's my lens. That's my lens, because my gold standard was not performing as well as I believed. And then I had the Viltrox here, right? And the Viltrox has, at 2.8, everything's hunky-dory. Look at that, straight down the line. But below 2.8, you have some very interesting shapes. That Coma is beautiful, folks. If you want like flying fish and angel babies, use the Viltrox under f2.8, you know, wider open than 2.8. You will get what look like little galaxies. But, you know, that's what it is. And I know that at f2.8, totally fine, Coma gone. And this is not a failing of the lens. Lens engineers have amazingly tough jobs. And I'm going to look straight at the camera for this one. Focus. The lens engineers, they have a tough job. They are refracting light in ways that only people that understand higher math and physics understand. And we appreciate you. Thank you, lens designers, for doing what you do. We really appreciate it. We might nitpick about things here and there. I tried to study lens design at some point, and I got deep enough into the math to understand what I'm saying now, which is, unless you're a total geek, you don't want to understand these things, but being aware of them are important. And you have to sacrifice one thing to get another thing. There's always push and pull. So to create lenses that are free from Coma, or mostly free from Coma, is a remarkable achievement. And thank goodness for science. We appreciate everybody that puts effort into listening to night photographers and saying, we want to make you happy, and saying that those aberrations are disadvantageous to our image making. Thank you again. The beginning and the end of the story is that you should be aware of what Coma is, and not to mistake that for chromatic aberration, the color fringing that you see around high contrast areas like star points. Chromatic aberration, easy to fix in Lightroom. Comatic aberration, Coma, you can't fix without doing a lot of cloning. There are some people that will sell you things for Photoshop cloning tools like little donuts so that you can get rid of the worst of them. But think about all of the stippling that you have to do with your graphics tablet or with your mouse or your rollerball or whatever. How many thousands of stars are in your images that you have to go to each of the corners and edges and go find those things and nuke them? Why not put a little effort into understanding what your lens has now prior to investment? You can even rent and test for Coma, right? Keeping in mind that rental lenses do get banged around. But knowing what it is and knowing how to look for it and knowing what your tolerance is for it are three important things. And then you can choose to make, good investments. Yeah. I don't see any questions, but I'm going to invite you guys as I'm thinking about what to wrap up on here. If you have questions, please drop them in the live stream. Would like to know, number one, have you looked for Coma on your lenses? Number two, which lenses are you using that exhibit Coma that you find disadvantageous? Please leave it in the live chat or in the comments if you're watching this later. Or if you have lenses that you have tested, at what f-stop is the Coma acceptable to you? We would love to see that. I would love to hear more about it, because we can't test every lens. Yeah, this is one of those things that's really important to do. I'm going to show the blog post one more time because if you want to pixel peep like I've been doing here in the video, you can click on this big green button that says download test images. It's going to take you to Google Drive, and you're going to be able to see all of my images in here, and you should be able to download these and zoomify. They're all full resolution JPEGs there, and you can go in and see the same things that I am. And my suggestion is to go to 800% zoom and, you know, look at the shape of the stars. And again, acceptable and ideal is round and crisp. Unacceptable or chromatic is irregular shapes, things that do not look like stars. That's it. All right. So we've got some comments here. We've got Juan saying that he loves his Sigma 21.4. It had Coma at 1.4 really bad, and 2.8 less, and 2.8 is a nice spot. Juan, that is my experience with a lot of lenses that go much faster than 2.8. The 2.8 seems to be a sweet spot. And for many reasons, that's advantageous to us because that's where we like to shoot star points, right? Jerry says that the 20mm Nikon has too much Coma at 1.8. I'd agree with you. Most lenses below 2.8 are probably going to exhibit Coma, you know. The Sigma 14-24 is perfect at 2.8, the widest f-stop. I've heard great things about that lens too. That one is, I guess, as becoming as legendary as the Nikon 14-24 2.8. Barry says, thanks. I'll do some testing on my lenses. At least you can find out what problems you have. Absolutely how I feel. You know, at least you won't be surprised. And that's better. If you're going to engage in a star stack, you're going to go for like 20 images, or, you know, like this might help you make a decision to stop down just a little bit more if you don't like the Coma that your lens has, or to save up or rent through some other lenses. Or if you're on a workshop or shooting with a buddy, ask if you can swap lenses and maybe, you know, like test theirs out. You know, there's a lot of ways. So Therese is saying she's struggling to find a lens for her Sony crop sensor camera that's low light and wider angle. The test looks mind-blowing. Yes, it is mind-blowing. And you don't need to be as meticulous as I am to create that PSD. But what you really need to do is to be deliberate in your methodology in approaching this. And, oh, I'm still sharing that screen. I show my face now. Be deliberate in your methodology so that you know for sure that you're looking at what you shot, right? If those lenses are not electronic, like the ones I was shooting, you have to do a paper grid. If they're electronic, that's fine. I'd still take paper notes just in case you don't remember what that image was for. Yeah, Therese, finding crop sensor wide angle lenses are probably more likely to experience Coma because they have to refract light even more. And that's the experience I had with the 7.5mm. It was a fisheye, really, you know, on the Fuji X-T1 that I had. It does need to bend light because it's a shorter focal length even more. So let us know how your test goes. We really appreciate that. And for all of you out there that tuned in, we appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for being part of what we do. If you appreciated this, do us a favor and hit the like button down below. If you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button and hit the dinger so you know every time we go live or publish a new video. We appreciate you. If you're new to us, welcome. Thanks. Maybe you'll take the opportunity to do some of those things that let us know that this is the right kind of stuff to do for you. All right. So Hadley asked me this: to what extent can Coma vary from one copy of a lens to another copy of the same lens? That's a really good question, Hadley. In my career, I've done a lot. one of those things was I used to work for Mamiya, and I was really familiar with the repair techs in the back. And one of the things that they taught me is that lenses can be sensitive. So manufacturers do their very best to set things within the range of acceptable tolerances. When they manufacture something, they say, these are the goalposts. Everything we do has to fit inside those goalposts. Like it has to focus to a certain point. The barrel should move a certain point. Everything should be plano parallel, you know, like the front and rear should be parallel to each other. All of these things are a dance, right? And manufacturers do their very best to make everything the same, but not everything is the same. So with CNC manufacturing, things have only gotten better. But I would say that there's a chance that there are minute differences from object to object within the same product family grouping. Like you get two of the same lens, there could be minor differences between them. And how you treat your gear also affects it. If your camera, drops, you might want to get it checked. If you're starting to see one corner is fuzzier than the other, get your gear tuned up. And that would be one thing. And making sure, like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, if your camera drops and it happens to drop on the lens and not on the lens hood, I mean, you might have taken your lens mount and moved it a little bit out of parallel with the imaging plane. Those things can happen too. But going back to the manufacturing, yeah, some manufacturers, let's say like the OEM manufacturers like Nikon, Canon, Sony, Fuji, all those guys, I would bet dollars to donuts that lens to lens, they're as similar as can be within human standards, right? If you're going down into third-party manufacturers, your results may vary. And that's why I suggest testing. There are some manufacturers, and I'm not picking on them, like you might need to test like a Samyang lens in like 4 or 5 of them, or a Rokinon lens, and get 4 or 5 of them and see which one of them is the one that's the sharpest. Because honestly, you're spending less because they spend less on quality assurance. And again, I'm not picking on them. This is just experience speaking. So I hate to say it, but you get what you pay for. So if you spend a little bit more, you're probably going to get something that had higher quality assurance testing during the manufacturing process. I hope that satisfies Hadley. I hope that brings some light onto your question. Julie asked, does heat affect coma? That's a question I've never been asked. And I'm going to run it through my science brain. I don't think it would. I think heat only affects things that we talk about traditionally, like electronics, like the image processor. The electricity running through heats up the chip. That's where heat sort of affects imaging. The glass is the glass, and the glass was born from extreme heat. It was forged, right? It was melted and then cooled, and then all of these layers were melted onto it and then cools. So I don't think that any amount of heat that we would experience as humans and being able to tolerate would ever affect coma on a lens. Only the sharpness that you're selecting by choosing a smaller aperture can reduce coma if it exists. And if there's a scientist out there that disagrees with me, please let me know. This is my assumption based on the knowledge that I have. All right. This is a good round of questions. Thanks, guys. All right. Well, I guess the other things that we have, we're going to have a fun Instagram live this week. Gabe's got a surprise for you guys tomorrow. So I would suggest tuning in to National Parks at Night on Instagram tomorrow for something live. Yeah, it's going to be fun. And many of you have already gotten some emails about our workshop. Season 6 is happening. We really appreciate everybody who has been along with us on the ride for whatever duration of time you have. You guys are the best. Thank you very much. And we look with bright eyes towards a future where we can all gather and do the thing that we love together again. And we have our fingers crossed, and there's a lot of people crossing their fingers with us for season 6. And check our website. If you're not on our mailing list, you should sign up for a mailing list because you'll get advance notice. That's tomorrow-ish, right? Other alumni have already gotten their advance notice. That's a perk of being an alumni. But we are excited about the future, and we look forward to doing fun things with you guys, with Night Photography in these beautiful, precious places. And we're going to continue to do our research on these technical topics that help you be more creative. since I don't see any more questions, I'm just going to say thank you. Have a wonderful evening. This has been BlogChat. We are National Parks at Night, and we look forward to seeing you at an event, at a workshop, online, or in your email. Have a great night.